Shostakovich, Dodecaphony, and St. Petersburg. Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you. Please forgive my voice. I'm dealing with some illness. And this is also a new area for me. I just finished defending, so this is maybe a little undercooked. And also next year in Italy. Uh, in an interview granted to a Polish journalist during a visit to the Warsaw Autumn Festival in 1959, Dmitry Shostakovich bemoaned the ubiquity of 12-tone compositions on festival programs, lamenting the narrow dogmatism of this artificially invented system, which rigidly fetters the creative imagination of composers and deprives them of individuality. In another quote from after a trip to Italy and France a year prior, he reported, the leading French masters are deeply troubled about the future of music in the West. They are troubled by the dissemination of false avant-garde trends, like the notorious Dodecaphony or concrete music among their youth. This stillborn art gains no recognition from the broad public. It attests to the ideological impasse, the crisis of bourgeois culture. In both cases, Shostakovich was acting as a mouthpiece, expressing Communist Party aesthetics from his increasingly insider position, one that was formalized only 2 years later with his fraught decision to join the Communist Party in 1960. In truth, his relationship to 12-tone composition was far more complex. Though, as Laurel Fay states, his distaste for dry, inexpressive music and his opposition to composition by rational system or mathematical formula were genuine, his words about dodecaphony would soften at at the same time as official policy surrounding 12-tone composition definitively shifted at the Second Congress of the RSFSR Union of Composers in May 1968, which endorsed this, quote, new expressive means of composition so long as it wasn't a, quote, end in and of itself. Shostakovich's words again come close to the party line. As far as the use of strictly technical devices from such musical systems as dodecaphony or aleatory is concerned, everything in good measure. The use of elements from these complex systems is fully justified if it is dictated by the concept of the composition. You know, to a certain extent, I think the formula, the end justifies the means, is valid in music. All means? All of them, if they contribute to the end objective. Only a year prior to this statement, Shostakovich had begun to employ 12-tone rows himself in an idiosyncratic fashion that, as Peter Schmelz suggests, bears close resemblance to the young composers he was hectoring in his 1959 Warsaw statements. Schmelz has persuasively traced this swirling influence between generations, pinpointing Pärt as a possible influence on Shostakovich's 12-tone use. And both he and Stephen C. Brown have detailed the idiosyncrasies of that style. But if the end indeed justifies the means, then the end was of great importance to Shostakovich, of course. In this paper, I interrogate some of the aesthetic and cultural connections that might have contributed to the formation of musical meaning around the 12-tone components of Shostakovich's scores, using his 7 verses of Alexander Blok, opus 127 for soprano, violin, cello, and piano as an example. The fixing of particular meanings to Shostakovich's or any composer's music has been debunked and is to be avoided. It seems contradictions are exactly the point in much of Shostakovich's music. Instead, I explore the resonances from text, tone, and technique that contribute to the rich semantic environment of this work. Shostakovich wrote 7 verses after struggling with composer's block following a heart attack he suffered on the evening of a concert of his works on the 28th of May, 1966, that featured several premieres. The 7 verses marked a satisfying and energizing return to composition. The piece was a response to Razumovich's request for vocalises to play with his wife, Galina Vishnevskaya, and it was Shostakovich that decided to add the texts. Though Blok was the product of old-fashioned intellectuals, His late in life embrace of the revolution, though short-lived and complicated, established his ideological credentials for the new regime. Unlike his sometime friend and colleague Andrei Bely, his reputation was secure in the Soviet era, and his works were published and widely available. Shortly before composing the cycle, Shostakovich asked his wife, Irina Supinskaya, to mark her favorite poems in a collection, and as expected, she chose several late works from Bloch's maturity. But Shostakovich selected 7 poems, 6 of which were from 1899, when Bloch was in his late teens and still relatively sheltered in the old world culture of his family. The poet was still enraptured by what he referred to as the, quote, dear old-fashioned eloquence of his youth, and Shostakovich selected them for their, quote, musicality and lyrical nature. Choosing early poems brought out a tension between expectation and fulfillment. One might expect a Bloch cycle to feature the mysterious and brooding poetry of the poet's maturity, for which he was known, marked by Dionysian decadence and pithy symbolism, and to forego the relative formal clarity and lyricism of his younger works, though these are by no means free of mysticism themselves. There were other ways in which the composer showed an active, interpretive, and curatorial voice. The first 2 poems of the cycle were titled by Bloch, but the remaining 5 songs have titles bestowed by the composer. The 3rd, 4th, and 6th take their titles from textual incipits, and Shostakovich titled the remaining 5th and 7th songs himself. The cyclic quality of the piece as a whole is only heightened by the intense motivic unity that knits the music of the songs together. Literary themes also run through sections of the cycle. As Francis Mays notes, the first 3 songs elaborate the theme of the voice. Ophelia's voice, found in madness and lost in suicide, naturally animates Ophelia's song, and was a common theme in symbolist poetry. Bloch's own Ophelia in Flowers and Adornments from 1898 is an example, and as with others, responded to Ophelia by Afanasy Fett. In Gamayun, Prophetic Bird, the titular creature's voice brings apocalyptic prophecies, common currency in late imperial Russia between the revolutions among intellectuals. The nostalgic and more quotidian human voice of Love Lost follows in We Are Together. The next 3 focus on images, and the first 2 of these, The Town Sleeps and Storm, reflect the visual and psychological world of the so-called Petersburg text, a literary palimpsest of philosophical and national musings focused on the physical and metaphysical space of St. Petersburg. The flickering street lamps, distant Neva, dour days, and terrifying stormy nights can be found among what the Tartu philologist Vladimir Toporov designated mythologemes, common images, words, and themes wrapped up in a Petersburg canon, beginning with Pushkin's Bronze Horseman and extending through Gogol, Dostoevsky, Bloch, Bely, and others. But the 6th poem, titled Secret Signs by the composer, stands out on a number of counts. The poem was written in October of 1902 and is the only poem of the collection composed after 1899 and after Bloch's greater exposure to mystical symbolism and figures like Vladimir Savalyov. The setting of the poem is set off by being the only one to be connected, Ataka, to the movement surrounding it. The clearest unique feature, however, is the 12-tone row beginning on D in the cello, tied over from the previous movement. From D, the row shifts up a semitone to introduce 3 descending diatonic thirds, separated by upward leaps of a 5th, E flat, D flat, C, G, F, E, B, A, G sharp, followed by another upward semitone length that drops by a 3rd, A, F sharp. F sharp then leaps to B, which is slowly established as something of a centric pitch as the cello line unfolds. The diatonic thirds that occupy 9 of the 12 pitches of the row are motivic throughout the cycle, appearing in many guises, many times, in every instrument and in every song. This motive, along with the falling third, rising fourth and sixth leap with a return by step saturate the cycle and lend it the previously stated tight-knit thematic sense. The row is both set apart from the rest of the texture and connected with a 4-bar lilting phrase that follows and settles on B. So this phrase in full, half row, half melody, always appears in linear form, unaccompanied, and always at the same transposition level. So I'm just going to play this is a short audio clip with all 3 iterations of the row in the song. As the rows in the 12th quartet do, those in Secret Signs contrast with their surrounding material in their tonal ambiguity. But unlike those of the 12th, this contrast is embedded in the repeated phrase itself, part atonal, part semicentric towards B. Shostakovich's 12-tone rows have been previously considered with respect to what Richard Taruskin has called the composer's increasingly resolute denial of optimism. According to Taruskin, quote, here is where the late Shostakovich surprising recourse to a few superficial trappings of 12-tone technique, officially denounced for its decadence and pessimism, seems to find its rationale. This particular association is rich in connections between contemporary discourse on the ills of dodecaphony and aspects of the Petersburg text. Firstly, dodecaphony's artificial prefabricated nature mimetically reflected something fixed, inert, and predetermined. This theme figured heavily in the aesthetics and metaphysics of the writer that more than any other defined the Petersburg text, Dostoevsky. As Liza Knapp suggests, Dostoevsky's metaphysics were defined by a tension between fixity, stasis, and inertia on the one hand, and movement, change, and the overcoming of inertia on the other. For Dostoevsky, inertia represented 2 forms of death. First, as literal physical material and anti-spiritual death of the body, and second, as a kind of death in life, a death of the mind and spirit through obsession, rumination, and fixity of thought. The second type plagued the author's Petersburgers, as with Raskolnikov and his idée fixe. At least in the 7th movement of Shostakovich's 14th Symphony, a setting of Guillaume Apollinaire's poem At the Santé Prison, which begins with a 12-tone fugue of extremely sparse orchestration and strange textures. At least in this passage, the composer used the fixity of dodecaphony to evoke a kind of death in life. In this case, the soul-crushing boredom of incarceration. As Levon Hakobian relates, for Shostakovich, 12-toneness functions rather like a means for constructing abstract, at times deliberately lifeless melodic lines that often contrast with an altogether different kind of music, one that points to the sphere of noble, lofty traditional values. Secret Signs is rich in death-related imagery, including the close of the first stanza, gold and red poppies, they weigh over me in my sleep, and the entirety of the last. The sky above me is already low. Black sleep weighs heavily in my chest. My destined end is near. Both war and fire are ahead. And though the last iteration of the row in the movement arrives in canon between the violin and the cello, a texture that often accompanies these projections of fixity in Shostakovich, these metaphors seem ill-fitting for the role of the row in Secret Signs. This is a symbolist world, uncanny and liminal, apocalyptic and prophetic, a world inaccessible by the word. And here it seems as though the rows of Secret Signs represents the unknowable, unseeable, and indecipherable. Though the motives of the row are structured to connect motivically with the rest of the cycle, and though they unfold related by the tonality defining interval of the fifth, the row of Secret Signs betrays no centricity. It remains as impermeable as the secret signs themselves that flare up on the blank, impenetrable wall. Mysterious messages from the world hold in the uncanny sense that undergirds the strange, slippery Petersburg tales of Gogol. A metaphor comes from the city of Petersburg itself. Our concept of reality is as precarious as an artificial city built on foundationless marshland. It is destined to collapse. This is a quality that the two related aesthetics, symbolist and Petersbergian, share, and one that was essential to Shostakovich's musical worldview. A glance at the texts of other songs in which Shostakovich uses rows only amplifies this connection. Secret Signs presents unreadable messages from other worlds, while My Poems, the first song of the 6 verses of Marina Tsvetaeva, Opus 143, the poet laments her own unread poems. In the third song, Love, from the Michelangelo suite, Opus 145, the poet sees and questions seeing a beautiful woman, only to discover that that which he sees is through her and from beyond her. Yet this last cycle also features a tone row in the 7th song, Dante, which seemingly has very little to do with these themes. In Shostakovich's hands, Dodecaphony acts as a semantic pointer, a musical topic. Only the meaning of that to which the pointer points, like so much of Shostakovich's music, is multivalent, ambiguous, and shifting. In some works, it seems to point to a sense of fixed rumination and stasis. In others, something uncanny, unknowable, unreadable, and mysterious. In still others, both, and yet others, neither. The 7 verses ends with a delicate and expansive paean to music itself. And here the choice to use Bloch's words is clear. Music was central to Bloch's apocalyptic vision, the embodiment of musical time, as Rebecca Mitchell theorizes. Only music is indispensable, said Bloch in 1913. Music was central to fin de siècle symbolist poetry, serving as an image for the theurgic power of art to transcend life. As a self-described atheist in a positivist and materialist political and social milieu, Shostakovich may not have been sympathetic to the metaphysical aspects of these mystical notions of music's power, but he used Bloch's message to forge his own tribute to this most ambiguous and unknowable art. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew, for another wonderful paper. Opening up for questions. Okay, I have one then.
Sure.
The themes that you find, how much are they sort of gravitating towards this particular artistic language, or how much or point of view, and how much do they sort of disperse themselves throughout his other works? Like, is this a fascination that lasts like a concentrated amount of time and he sort of gets very heated up by these ideas? Or is it a kind of thing that actually becomes a leitmotif for himself too?
Yeah, well, all of the works in which he employs tone rows are late works. So this was the first. And there are only, I maybe something like 7 or 8. There are a few quartets, the 13th quartet, the 12th quartet, and then of course the 14th symphony, and then the song cycles. And this is something I'm kind of trying to explore. You know, what I really wanted to do was take a deep look at the contemporary critical language around 12-tone composition in Russia, just to see what was actually being said, to sort of explore the ways in which Shostakovich might have used some of the sort of noise about Dodecaphony in the press and in the things that he was saying about it, to kind of paint a kind of complicated meaning on his own use. But I haven't had a chance to do that yet. But I do think there is a striking sort of consistency to the style associated with these particular tone rows. For instance, he basically never uses rows vertically. They are almost always linear and very sort of clearly exposed. Separate. I think all contributes to their kind of sense of being acting almost like a musical topic, or something that really draws attention to itself. They tend to come out of the texture marked as a type of melodic statement or thematic statement.
So is it something that evolved though, because I get the impression it's a bit like it's almost like in a Greek chorus tragedy. It's like another voice coming in and commenting in an already mature style. Forgive me if I've got the wrong impression.
Yeah.
But it from your paper, for me, it felt like it's like another commentator maybe responding rather than a dramatic shift in style.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely. And that's one of the things that's interesting to see how his use interacts with the already established sort of chromatic thematic tendencies in his style. And in fact, one of the sort of tendencies that seems almost ubiquitous with Shostakovich is this tendency to combine fourths and fifths with semitone motion. And you find that in the way that he uses, the way that he constructs tone rows. The same thing with almost ubiquitous downward facing lines, falling lines, and that is again the way that a lot of these 12-tone rows appear. William.
Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you, Matthew. This is part of your developing dissertation, I take it?
No, this is actually, I just finished. So this is kind of a sidestep, and that's what I was saying. I actually just recently finished. So
congratulations.
Thank you.
I really don't have a question as much as a comment. I know that when I did working on the 12-tone works in Red Schmelz and Gobian and the different comments that I already done, that you've done such a nice job building upon that I found my composition students who were studying modern techniques were so engrossed in the way Shostakovich used the 12-tone technique. So, it might be an interesting place to go into composition conferences or something like this that to speak to composers as well as musicologists and theorists who are interested in it, because I find that the modern Western composition students is really intrigued by the different approach to the 12-tone writing that Shostakovich did. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. Even in that short Tereskin quote, even kind of embedded in that, and I know Tereskin tends to be more sympathetic to Shostakovich's style, but even kind of in that is this little bit of condescension. He describes it as the sort of cursory or approach to 12-tone, and that's something 12-tone technique. And that's something that I appreciated about, for instance, Stephen C. Brown's work, is that he tries to sort of look at it as something that's different and not simply a subpar application of a Western technique, which was the way that it was understood for a long time. But I'll also say, I mean, looking at dodecaphony in the Soviet Union is new to me as well. I mean, I did a little bit of work on it with my dissertation with the quartets, but so this is, yeah, it's really fascinating, and I'm looking forward to doing more work on that.
Simon, did you have a question? Sorry, I didn't know.
Only just from your description of these 12-tone passages, it seems that one of the things you're mapping out is a kind of Bergian approach to it, more humane on one hand, and also a selection of rows or subsets of rows that have tonal implications. And as much as Hakabian has talked about the 11th Symphony, 1905 Symphony, is a kind of homage to the 20s. I'm wondering whether or not you can think about his use of 12-tone systems, not as Schoenberg or Webern, but as more Bergian, as a kind of homage or throwback to a time when he could openly declare his appreciation and affection for Berg's operas. Which, it leads you open to the question of like what, in a different context might have been Lady Macbeth, had he gone in a more Bergian direction with that opera.
Yeah, that's a fascinating idea, and something that seems very worth exploring. And it's also interesting to think about. So, in a similar way to the way Berg treated Rose, with this sort of tonal implications embedded in the way that they're constructed. It's interesting to see how Shostakovich creates his rows so that they have this, because there's a very kind of specific kind of modal quality to Shostakovich's own linear writing, and it's really interesting to see how he is able to infuse his rows in a similar manner with that particular style. So in a way that is similar to Berg, but reflecting his own melodic approach.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
I think it was really actually thought-provoking session generally to be witnessing on Zoom, and well, unfortunately, not fortunately. So thank you to all the participants of this session, and I think I'm going to be handing over to Simon actually to be chairing the next set.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maria. Larissa, do you want to give folks a break till another 6 minutes maybe, and then we can start, officially 1/2 hour late?
Maybe, how many minutes did you say?
Well, it's 5 minutes to the hour. So 5 minutes to noon here in the United States, but 5 minutes to 6 there. So do you want to give people a 5-minute break and then we can begin?
Oh, 5-minute break, not a problem. Yes, sure.
Okay. Oh, okay. So in 5 minutes, we'll convene and into the session on Russian women composers and performers. See you in a few.